Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot we have Animal Court. If you've spent some time over on our sister channel Bumblebee, or you love history, this may be one that you already know because it truly is a very bizarre part of history. The history of animals being put on trial goes pretty far back, as it is believed it has roots back in ancient Athens, but it was definitely common practice as recently as the 18th century. Clerical courts would go after things like rats, weevils, flies, locusts, and serpents for damaging crops, and when punished, they weren't just liable for damages, they could be banished and excommunicated. Like, imagine trying to banish a fly. You're like, get out of here. I don't know. This isn't where it ends though. In civil criminal court, they'd have livestock being tried for violence against humans. Like, I'm sorry, Your Honor, my client could not tell the prosecution that she didn't want to be milked because she is a cow. Kicking was simply the only way. I'm sorry, but this one is fully my favorite story. So in 16th century France, a jurist named Barthélemy had the best and funniest defense for a group of rats who were being put on trial but failed to show up for their court date. I would have said, I apologize, Your Honor, but my clients were helping a young boy named Alfredo, but this guy just argued that perhaps the summons had not been issued widely enough. A new summons was then issued, and when the rats failed to show up for their second court date, he then justified it again, saying, quote, "On the ground of the length and difficulty of the journey and the serious perils which attend it, owing to the unwearied vigilance of their mortal enemies, the cats." I want this guy to be my lawyer. There are endless tales of the bizarrities of animal trials throughout history. Some are silly like this rat one, but some are very questionable and considerably darker as well. In our number 9 spot today we have the timeline. Cleopatra is well known for being the queen of the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt from 51 to 30 BC, and she was its last active ruler. When many of us think of ancient Egypt, while there are plenty of famous rulers and figures from the time, Cleopatra is one of the first names we think of. Another thing we think of when we think of ancient Egypt are the pyramids of Giza, which were royal tombs that were built for 3 different pharaohs, the oldest of the 3 being the one built for Khufu. It is estimated that this one took about 27 years to build, and it was made in the 26th century BC. So these pyramids were made, according to historians, somewhere between 2550 and 2490 BC, and then about 2421 years later, Cleopatra was born. Then, when she was 39 years old in 30 BC, she passed away. You might be wondering where I'm going with this, but I promise there's a point. Flash forward from then, about 2037 years later, and now we're at 2007, which is the year that the first iPhone was released. What I'm getting at is that there is more time between the pyramids of Giza being built and the life of Cleopatra than there is from the life of Cleopatra to the first iPhone. That's truly one of the most insane things I've ever heard. It really warps our perception of time, but it also just shows how quickly we and technology have evolved. In our number 8 spot today we have cats. Okay, I've talked about this story once before, but I had to bring it back because it actually makes me laugh so hard and I can't believe it's real. So in the book The Epidemics of the Middle Ages, which was written by J.F. Hecker in 1844, there was a very strange case of mass hysteria that broke out among nuns in a French convent. The exact time of this situation wasn't specified, but we know it was in the Middle Ages, of course, and honestly, when you hear what happened, time is the least important part of this story. So basically, one day a nun in this French convent started to meow like a cat. I'm not sure why, I'm not sure how this started, all I know is that it happened. And then you know what else happened? Other nuns in the convent also began to meow like cats. Eventually it became such a thing that all of the nuns in the convent would meow together for a certain period of time, and of course everyone surrounding this area was like, what the f is going on right now? Apparently the way that this stopped was the police came and threatened to whip the nuns if the meowing didn't stop, and that's all it took. I guess they probably could have just thrown some cucumbers down and called it a day. In our number 7 spot today we have Jurassic Park. When we think of the times of dinosaurs, we tend to think of them all roaming the planet at one time, but that's certainly not the case. Dinosaur communities were not only spread apart by geography, but also by time, and the age of dinosaurs lasted for so long that it includes 3 separate geologic time periods. That is exactly how it is possible for this bizarre fact to be true, and that is the fact that there is more time separating the Tyrannosaurus rex from the Stegosaurus than there is separating the Tyrannosaurus Stegosaurus rex from humans. Stegosaurus, you know, those herbivores with the plates on their back and the spikes on their tail, yeah, they roamed Earth about 150 million years ago during the Jurassic period of the age of dinosaurs. Then it is said that the T-Rex first appeared about 80 million years after the Stegosaurus had been extinct, and that was about 67 million years ago from now. This means that while 80 million years separated those two, there's only 67 million years that separate us from the giant T-Rex. It's still a long time, but it's just very mind-boggling information as well. In our number 6 spot today we have Project X. All the way back about 500 years ago, for 2.5 weeks in June of 1520, both England's Henry VIII and France's Francis I, two of the greatest monarchs in Renaissance Europe, yeah, they threw a joint birthday party that lasted 18 days and cost about $19 million by today's standards. Not only was this a chance for them to celebrate their friendship, but it was also a chance for them to try and outdo or one-up one another. So for this huge bash, about 12,000 people showed up and gathered in the fields of the northern tip of what is now France. All tents, costumes, and decorations were gold embellished, guests were fed 29,000 fish, 98,000 eggs, 6,475 birds, 2,200 sheep, and 216,000 gallons of wine, of course, and apparently they also served swans and dolphins. I have no idea how they know this, but I guess someone must have kept quite a detailed journal about this party, but also, could you blame them? There were jousts, wrestling matches, and other quote tests of athletic prowess that were all performed in elaborate masks. The two kings both wanted to outdo each other, but there were clear rules that they could not compete against each other during the celebrations because, well, ego. That fragile little thing. In the end, the party seemed to be a huge success, and everyone's just been trying to outdo them since. In our number 5 spot today we have the Emperor of the United States. Some of you may have heard of this man before, but truthfully I had never heard of this absolutely bonkers story until doing this video. Basically, Joshua Norton was just a guy from San Francisco. Imagine if I just ended the point there. I'm not going to, but how annoying would that be? Anyway, he just hated all of the political stuff that was going on at the time and figured he could do a better job, and instead of just posting about that on Facebook, he decided to actually do something. It wasn't the best something, but it was still something nonetheless. He basically just proclaimed that he was now the Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico. Okay, sure Josh. So basically, while he had no real power, he just went around and people liked him so much that they started to treat him like he was royalty. Like so much so that any currency that was issued under his name would be accepted at a ton of places in the area. At one point in time, he was taken into custody by a private security force because I guess he was having some sort of mental health struggle, and so many people in the city were upset about it that not only did the police chief let him go because he hadn't committed any actual crime, but he, Joshua, also gave an imperial pardon to the man who had detained him. Another time, a riot formed in the city and was getting pretty aggressive, and Joshua just stood in front of them and calmly prayed, which ended up actually dispersing the crowd. Apparently there's a ton of other crazy stuff he also did, and this just barely scratches the surface. In our number 4 spot today we have the elder shark. The Earth has a long history that predates humans by quite a bit, and when we think back to the origins of the Earth, it once looked like a completely different planet than it does now. In fact, the Earth has undergone a ton of changes throughout its 4.5 billion year life so far, and while the Earth was once a very uninhabitable place for plant and animal life, it slowly has become a great home for both. So what if I told you that sharks have a longer history on this Earth than trees do? It sounds strange, but according to experts, the earliest species that scientists can classify as a tree lived about 350 million years ago. That's still a super long time, obviously, but sharks can still be traced back to at least 50 million years earlier. Sharks have fossil records that date back to some 400 million years ago, which clearly places them quite a bit ahead of trees. It's super weird to think about sharks swimming around while there's no trees, but that likely isn't the strangest scenario our Earth has seen during its rich history. In our number 3 spot today we have Edgar Allan Poe. Okay, this is a story that actually convinced me that Edgar Allan Poe is a time traveler, and it's because of 2 separate stories he wrote that both turned out to be exceptionally true and real, but not until after they had been written. Firstly, Poe's only complete novel was published in 1838, and it tells the tale of mutiny on a whaling ship lost at sea. The men on the ship realize that they need to resort to extreme measures in order to stay alive, so they begin drawing straws to see who they're going to sacrifice for food. A boy named Richard Parker drew the shortest straw and therefore became the next meal. Okay, so let's fast forward 46 years to 1884, and in real life there are now 4 men who have been set adrift after the sinking of a yacht. These men found themselves in a similar predicament to the novels, and I kid you not, they end up taking the same route and elected to take the life of and then eat a cabin boy. The cabin boy's name? Richard Parker! Okay, so that's weird example number 1, now here's number 2. In 1840, Poe penned the gruesome story The Businessman, in which the narrator suffers a traumatic head injury as a child and later a violent life. The weird thing about this story is that he was able to grasp frontal lobe injury so well before it was even able to be greatly studied, as the first time behavioral changes caused by this kind of injury were able to be studied didn't come until 1848. An actual neurologist, Eric Alschuler, wrote, quote, "There's a dozen symptoms and he knows every single one. There's everything in that story. We've hardly learned anything more. It's so exact that it's just weird." It's like he had a time machine. In our number 2 spot today, we have the birthday. When we think of terrible things that happened in our history, sometimes we like to pretend that they happened longer ago than they really did in order to try and distance ourselves from the poor decisions, but that truly does a disservice to everyone involved. It's easy to forget that things like the events that took place during the Second World War were less than 100 years ago, or how the civil rights movement took place during a lot of our parents' and definitely our grandparents' lives. The photos we are shown might be in black and white, but they definitely had color back then. As an example of just how close to some sort of these events we really are, here's a bizarre little known fact. Barbara Walters, Martin Luther King Jr., and Anne Frank were all born in the same year. 1929. That is absolutely insane to think about. The only one of these 3 who is still alive is Barbara, but it's extremely important to note that if not for hatred, prejudice, and injustice, it's likely that perhaps all 3 of these people would still be alive today. This really is just a reminder of how close to those times we really are, and while we certainly have come a long way, there is always more work to be done. In our number 1 spot today, we have the wave. On January 15th, 1919, in Boston, there was a huge, massive storage tank that was filled to the brim with molasses. We're talking about 2.3 million gallons of this stuff sitting in this tank, and on that day the tank broke and sent a 15-foot tall wave of sticky, gooey syrup flowing throughout the city. I panic when I have 1 tablespoon of that stuff because it's so sticky and goopy. I can't imagine the sight of 2.3 million gallons of it coming crashing down. Someone wrote about how the molasses wave hit houses in the area, saying that they, quote, seemed to cringe up as though they were made of pasteboard. While this story sounds silly and wacky, it's actually deadly. Not only did the wave trap and then kill most of the laborers that were nearby, but there were also others in the area who lost their lives as well. In the end, it is estimated that about 150 people were injured in this accident and 21 people lost their lives. On the day of the accident, the molasses was estimated to be moving at about 35 miles per hour. That would genuinely be terrifying. Like, you can't run away from it, you can't escape into a house, there's literally nothing you can do except for try and surf this massive wave of molasses. In the end, after tons of lawsuits, it was decided that the company was to blame for the accidents because their inspections of the tanks weren't thorough enough. There were about 100 settlements made out of court, and the company ended up paying somewhere from $500,000 to $1 million in the end, which is about $16.1 million today.
Number 10. The 1904 Olympic Marathon. The 1904 Olympic Marathon probably had some of the most interesting competitors ever. It wasn't just one person who made this race bizarre, but a whole handful of people and strange circumstances. First off, the course was just absolutely covered in dust, and breathing it in caused a bunch of the runners to suffer severe internal injuries. So right off the bat, the race just totally sucked. The man who finished the race in first place got some bad cramps and decided he was just gonna hitch a ride in a car. Then he got out near the finish line and ran across. The guy who came in second place was given a mixture of different foods and chemicals, which were actually a poison used to kill rodents, but they were trying to use it as like a steroid to make him a better runner, and instead his crew ended up carrying him across the finish line. The guy who came fourth gambled all his money when he got to the United States and ended up having to wear full dress clothing to the race, using a knife to cut his pants into shorts. He then ate some apples during the race, got sick, and took a nap, but still came fourth. Number 9. Robert Liston surgery. We all know that medical practices throughout history were a bit dodgy, and they didn't have a lot of the comforts that we have today. A man named Robert Liston was known as one of the fastest surgeons in the 1800s, and you had to be fast because they didn't have anesthesia, so surgery basically sucked for everybody involved. Liston also became the only person to perform a surgery with a 300% mortality rate. He was performing a leg amputation surgery, but worked so fast he accidentally cut off 2 of his assistant's fingers. Both the patient and the assistant died of infection because the saw he used was dirty. The third death occurred when, during the procedure, Liston accidentally sliced a nearby doctor's coat. But just the coat. The doctor thought he had been cut open, went into shock, and died of a heart attack, leading to 3 people dying during an operation meant to just save 1 person. Number 8. Salem Tomato Trial. We're all well aware of the Salem Witch Trials, but you've probably never heard of the Salem Tomato Trials. In the early 1800s, tomatoes were put on trial in Salem, New Jersey because they were believed to be poisonous. The tomato was also considered a sinful fruit because it can act as a mild aphrodisiac. Only one man in the town defended tomatoes during the trial and even tried to bring about tomato growing competitions so people would be less afraid. He would also regularly eat them in front of everybody, leading most people to think he was completely insane. Growing annoyed with the trial and fear of tomatoes, he decided to walk in front of the courthouse with an entire basket of tomatoes in his hands. He then proceeded to eat the entire pile of tomatoes as a crowd gathered around and watched, and to their shock, the man did not immediately die. This was enough to finally convince people that tomatoes were not evil. Number 7. Wojtek. During the Second World War, the Polish army recruited one of the most unique soldiers ever, a bear named Wojtek, and based on the soldier's accounts, he was actually pretty damn cool. The Polish soldiers found the bear cub by the side of a road, his mother apparently having been killed by hunters. So the soldiers took him in and raised him, and a civilian refugee even helped to train the animal. In order to get him on a British transport ship, he was officially enlisted as a Polish soldier, being given a paybook, serial number, and the rank of private. He would apparently sleep in the bunks with the other soldiers and was also a huge fan of beer and cigarettes. He also would do actual work for the army, helping to transport supplies and carry heavy boxes of ammunition. After the war, he was relocated to the Edinburgh Zoo, where he lived out the rest of his days, passing away at the age of 21. The average lifespan of a bear is 20 to 30 years, so that's really not bad for a guy raised on beer and cigarettes. Number 6. Nuclear war. Did you know that we were probably a lot closer to nuclear war than we thought? Back during the Cold War in the 80s, everyone was preparing for oncoming nuclear conflict, building bunkers and hiding resources in the case of having to regrow a barren landscape. This didn't happen, and it was later revealed that we were saved from this outcome by a single man. In 1983, a freak accident where sunlight reflected off high altitude clouds caused a Soviet satellite system to indicate that there were 5 incoming missiles, which they of course assumed to be coming from the American military. A lieutenant colonel by the name of Stanislav reasoned that if the United States were actually starting a nuclear war, it would be a full attack and not just 5 missiles. So he called it a false alarm and, against his orders, refused to initiate their own nuclear launch out of retaliation. Number 5. New Atlantis. In 1964, Ernest Hemingway's younger brother named Lester sailed out to international waters near Jamaica and started his own country. Yeah, he sailed a barge made out of bamboo that was about 8 by 30 feet and declared it a micronation that was half independent and half part of the United States. So how did he manage to do that? He discovered an obscure law called the Guano Islands Act of 1856, which says that US citizens can claim ownership of unclaimed islands that had guano deposits, which, if you're not aware, is bird and bat. He claimed his new nation to be called New Atlantis and even wrote a new constitution for it, though this constitution was actually just the United States Constitution, with every mention of the United States being changed to New Atlantis. The plan was to use this as a publicity stunt to raise money and use the raft as a research facility. Unfortunately, New Atlantis was wrecked by a tropical storm just 2 years after it was constructed. Number 4. The War on Cats. Pope Gregory IX lived from 11 1145 to 1241 and became the Pope when he was already over 80 years old. He had a history as a lawyer and was known for putting a few different motions through during his time as head of the church. Unfortunately for cat lovers, Gregory was a bit of a red flag because he was apparently more of a dog person. He put forward the first ever church documents that condemned black cats as being instruments of Satan, effectively starting the war on cats and placing a target on the head of every black cat in the area. Shortly after Gregory's time, the Black Death came about thanks to diseased rats spreading the infection all over the place and leading to a lot of people living during that era having a pretty bad time. Some people blame the Black Death on Gregory's war on cats because they say, due to the reduced cat population, the rat population inflated, so they were just running around willy-nilly spreading disease. Number 3. The Siege of Weinsberg. Weinsberg is a town near the southwest part of Germany. The name of the castle that sits above the town roughly translates to Women's Faithfulness Castle, so why is that? In the year 1140, King Conrad III defeated the Duke of Welf and placed the town of Weinsberg under siege. The women negotiated a surrender that held the terms that they would be allowed to leave the town unharmed with whatever they could carry on their shoulders. Conrad probably thought that they were just gonna take their children, clothes, food, maybe a goat. What he didn't expect was for all the women of the town to take their husbands and other men upon their shoulders and carry them out of town. The king's people were like, yo dude, they can't do that, but the king was like, nah, that's actually kind of valid and let it happen, saying a king should always stand by his word. Number 2. Astronomer's pet moose. A 16th century astronomer who discovered the supernova was known not only for that, but also for just being a bit of a bizarre guy. A few of his odd behaviors included losing his nose in a duel, keeping a jester/clairvoyant in his house, and having a pet moose. The pet moose was apparently just as bizarre as he was. The moose apparently lived in the castle with him and would walk alongside him like a loyal dog, and apparently also had an unquenchable thirst for Danish beer. Him and his pet became extremely popular, and they would often be invited to dinner parties together to show off the moose's tame behavior. Unfortunately, the moose's alcoholism got out of control at one of these dinner parties and he had a bit too much to drink. He chugged beers with noblemen until he managed to stumble up a set of stairs in the castle before falling off and passing away. Number 1. The latrine disaster of 1184. German noblemen during the Roman Empire would often meet to have discussions over land disputes and try to find some temporary peace. King Henry VI called for a meeting over a dispute which would take place in the Church of St. Peter in Erfurt. They all gathered in a room that was directly above the building's toilet pit. The weight of all the people on the floor, add to that their heavy chain clothing, caused the floor to collapse and they all fell into the pit below. Between 60 and 100 of the people gathered there ended up passing away in the human waste, whether it be from drowning or being crushed by the floor. One of the deaths was Count Heinrich of Schwarzburg, who had previously joked he would perish in his own shit if he ever failed his title.
Number 10. Boiling. Yeah, throwback to the Middle Ages when we would boil people. Awesome. Any Game of Thrones fans out there? Some of this is too accurate. In 1531, the time King Henry VIII was unfortunately running the show, they made boiling a capital punishment. Say no more. I'm never breaking the law, ever. Not even thinking about it. Poisoning somebody back then was equal to treason, obviously. Therefore, it was agreed that you should be boiled, slowly, might I add, if you were caught tampering with a Royals beverage, their IPA. You know what I mean? You drop a little bit of something in there, you're out. You're getting boiled. That's horrible. That's the worst thing I've heard today. Number 9. The Battle of Zappolino. Turning the calendars back a little further, this time to 1325, the Battle of Zappolino was a large-scale event over a bucket. Yeah, I wish I was joking. War of the Oaken Bucket, that's also what it's referred to as. This beef was between two Italian towns, Bologna and Modena. It all kicked off when soldiers from Modena snuck into Bologna with intentions to steal. What are they gonna steal? Are they gonna steal the Declaration of Independence? No, they're gonna steal a wooden bucket from the city's well, because, you know, resources were quite sparse back then. If you steal a bucket, that's equivalent amounted to stealing, something big. That's like a pretty big heist back then. The Bolognese declared war then, obviously, and then sent in an invading force of 30,000 foot soldiers, as well as 2,000 cavaliers. The city of Medina had a smaller army. They only had 500 infantrymen and 2,000 cavalry forces. Thing is, these guys, they still won. Yeah, even though they had the lower force, they still got it. These guys chased the larger army way back to Bologna while destroying every town in the process. Now, some recall them bringing the bucket back just to taunt the city, which is pretty horrible, but I'm like, yeah, you know what? I kind of would too. I don't know. The bucket is currently on display still in Medina, so if you want to go see it, there you go. Go grab the kids and the wife. Say, hey, we're going on a trip. We're gonna go see a bucket. Yeah, bright and early. Number 8, the hottest wedding in town. It's January 28th, 1393, and you are formally invited to a masquerade ball. Oh, how lucky are you? Let's do this. The French Queen Isabeau of Bavaria is hosting one of the most lavish parties of the decade. When the French royal court was celebrating the marriage of one of the Queen's ladies in waiting, it was a big deal, right? It was a happy day. For some, the best day of their lives. For others at this ball, not so great. King Charles VI, he had 5 companions perform a dance, this, theater routine. They did a performance dressed as beasts. They were committed to the bit, I'll add. They had masks, they had big baggy outfits, lots of linen, and lots of stuffing to appear as if they were real beasts. Good stuff, right? So far, we're having a great time, a dazzling time. The party was going well, wine was spilling, beasts were roaring, but one rule was put into place before this party even started. Absolutely, positively, no candles. Yeah, what an obvious fire hazard that would be, right? Well, the Duke of Orleans, he had a little too much fun prior to this event, and he forgot the first rule of Fire Club when he arrived. The guy walked in with a lit torch. Some accounts say that he dropped the torch by accident, others say that he got too close, trying to guess the identity of one of the beasts. Either way, flames were spread fast, and this tragic event took the lives of 4 people in total. Hence the name, you may recognize, Ball of the Burning Men. Number 7, medieval pub night. Okay, it's almost the weekend now. We're starting to get ready to see friends, maybe hit up the local pub. Now, imagine for a second that it's the 14th century. What are we doing, right? You and your friend decide to hit the big city, the big medieval city, right? Check out one of those hot new medieval taverns that every peasant from the north keeps talking about. Now, you can't get an Uber quite yet, so instead, here's what you should expect. For starters, unless you somehow had a horse in the 14th century, bravo, it's like having a Tesla. Nice, must be nice. You were walking quite a ways just to get to the tavern. And if the commute didn't kill you, the disease waiting in the city probably would. Living in the medieval city was horrible. It was isolated, it was dirty, it was filled with rats, crime, strict curfews had to be put into place, violent crimes would happen all night long. Number 6, Roman punishments. This was a form of capital punishment used, of course, in ancient Rome, and also used in the Middle Ages as well, but its origins go back quite a ways. Yeah, metal would be heated up in a cauldron for a very long time, just hot metal, to the point where it was molten, just a soup of minerals. And at that point, they would pour said molten mineral soup down the throat of the accused. Yeah, this is why you don't break the law in the Dark Ages. Say no more. This was for the worst of the worst, obviously. It was execution by molten metal. It was supposedly done to wealthy Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus back in ancient Rome. So yeah, like I said, the OGs go way back. The metal would burn your muscle inside, literally cooking it from the inside out, and after a few moments, of course, it would harden and you would, yeah, horrible? I agree. Let's hit that thumbs up, get the karma back up, get that energy back up, and let's move on. Number 5, plague rats. Yeah, just kidding, it's all disgusting. Say we go to the medieval pub, right? Say we beat the odds and we arrive. That's a feat in itself. We reserved a table, we're in, now you're with your friends and family, drinking ale, having a great time. Well, it'd be a shame if, say, hundreds of rats started to swarm your feet out of nowhere, right? That'd be pretty mildly uncomfortable while you're trying to eat some soup. Yeah, the plague rolled, or rather crawled, into town back in 1328, and it lasted until 1350. And it was actually horrible. It was so bad. We think of our own plague here in history and we compare it, and I'll tell you one thing. I never saw any swarms of black rats attacking anyone's feet. Didn't see that once over the past few years. By 1530, the European population was reduced by 1/3, and rats were almost entirely to blame. These hairy balls of disease, they passed it on to everybody. They didn't have public transit back then, right? We weren't sharing offices, we weren't spreading disease that way. It was rats running rampant just under your feet. That's disgusting. Number 4, combat of the 30. Now this battle was arranged beforehand, right? It was bring your shiniest armor and your most golden gal and arrive fancy looking and meet us at the battlefield in Brittany. Both sides got to pick 30 champions each. They had to pick the best knights in all of their land, all to battle each other. One side represents the King of England, the other France. Now this whole thing was arranged by a captain in the French banner named Jean de Beaumanoir. Now this event pulled in a crowd, drinks were served throughout said crowd, and this fight lasted a very long time. Again, it was entertainment entertainment. Hours went by and 4 French knights had fallen, as well as 2 Englishmen. So they took breaks. It was like a sporting event, really. And by the end of the whole thing, the English ended up surrendering after losing 9 knights, and the French in total lost 6. Number 3, Bacchanalia. Have you ever dreamt of joining an ancient Roman wine cult? Me neither. But in the 2nd century BC, it would have been a perfect time to maybe go and try it out. Ancient Romans, what they would do back then, they would gather in these cultic celebrations, all in the name of Bacchus, the wine god, right? Of course, let's all meet and get naked and drink wine. These gatherings would be held in private, thank God, or quiet areas of the woods. A little creepy, imagine bumping into that. And what they would do is they would dance, they would cook food, eat, drink some more, maybe drink a little too much, and then things would get a little sweaty. They would get a little intimate, if you know what I'm saying. That was the whole point of this Roman cult. You'd gather in small homes to dance the night away, you could say. Some accounts say people would often get poisoned in these ancient wine parties, so by time 186 rolled around, the Roman Senate voted to end these cult gatherings entirely. Number 2, a lot of cheese. 1837, President Andrew Jackson, he knew this, okay? He was ahead of the game. He knew cheese was the main event, so during his last White House party as president, officially, he ordered a 1,500-pound brick of cheese. Then he invited 10,000 of his closest friends, who I hope weren't lactose intolerant, and they all went to town. They made history that day, literally. To move such a unit of cheese to the White House from New York, let's talk about that. Here we go. Officials had to use 24 horses just to move this thing, and it had to sit for 2 years before they could even open it up and dive in. Prepared for 2 years and gone in 2 hours. And finally, number 1, pleasures of the Enchanted Isle. If you think Elon Musk is wasting time and resources, you should have seen King Louis XIV. What a mess. Back in May 1664, King Louis XIV decided to throw a big celebration for his mistress. He told all invited that the party was for his mother, but really the spotlight was on his lady the entire time. How mean is that, right? Already you're like, ugh, what a diva this guy is. This party though, it was a week long. How exhausting is that? Louis went above and beyond to keep the party going. He had fun outfits, a massive fake palace, a big float that looked like a whale, because that's fun, I guess. And of course, to cap it all off, a ballet show, just to finish the week-long festival. And while setting off fireworks on day 7, however, the fake palace caught real fire. And at that point, everybody was ordered to go home.
Starting off at number 10, vampire killings. So starting us off, we have the supposed vampire killings from the 1800s. Now, spoiler alert here, they weren't actually vampires. Well, I guess I don't know that for sure, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and say they weren't. Anyways, back in the 1800s, people in New England believed that cadavers were rising from their graves at night and preying on the living. So to solve this problem, they began exhuming the cadavers. Now, some kept it simple and just turned the cadaver face down, but others jumped to more extreme methods like ripping the bones apart and rearranging them, or burning the deceased person's heart and inhaling the smoke. Apparently at the time, it was believed inhaling the smoke cured tuberculosis, though I can only imagine it made matters much worse for them. Some towns were so into the ritual that they would even hold festivals during the process and celebrate the exhumation and subsequent destruction of the corpses altogether. So while it was incredibly unsettling, they did truly believe they were vampires haunting them in the night, so I guess it gave them some peace of mind. Next up at number 9, dentures. While today dentures are made from composite resin or sometimes porcelain, during the 18th and 19th centuries, of course, those materials weren't available. But as you can imagine, people were still losing teeth at an even higher rate due to the high sugar diet, attempted teeth whitening, which was really just wearing away their enamel instead of brightening it, and the overall lack of knowledge around hygiene. So dentures were still needed and wanted by many. So what was their material of choice? Well, for the easiest and most profitable route, many would acquire the teeth from dead bodies. Although if you had some money, you might be able to afford dentures made from ivory. Other materials were sometimes the teeth of animals or wood, but honestly, I think we can all agree that none of those sound like terribly sanitary options, considering professional physicians at the time weren't sterilizing instruments and some didn't even believe in disinfecting prior to surgery. Next up at number 8, stained glass. glass. If you walk into just about any old church, you'll notice the walls are decorated with beautiful stained glass. But what might surprise you is that in some of the particularly older pieces, there is a strange ingredient that helps it all come together. In 1112, a German monk wrote about the process of creating the beautifully colored glass, and as he detailed, it starts off, innocently enough, adding sand and potash at a high temp until it becomes molten. From there, they'd add a stabilizer before coloring the glass with different metallic oxides like copper, cobalt, and gold. But once the glass was cooled and shaped, the small details were added by paint. They made the paint usually from lead or copper and would then suspend it in urine. So quite literally, some of those old stained glass windows were painted with pea paint, which I mean kind of just makes me giggle if I'm honest, but it is definitely a weird ingredient to think about being in paint. Coming in at number 7, leather-bound books. Nowadays, it's unusual to even find real leather on anything, but once upon a time, the leather on books wasn't even from cows. It was from people. Called anthropodermic bibliopegi, the books were made in a similar way as they would now, but obviously with one huge difference. They used human skin instead of an animal. While there are actually only 18 confirmed books of its kind that still exist, we have no idea just how many there could have been all those years ago. Allegedly, the books were usually made from executed convicts, and during the French Revolution, there were rumors that a tannery for human skin was established outside of Paris. I mean, it kind of gives me the willies to think about it, and I'm just glad we've moved on to a different material to bind our books today. Next up at number 6, Minnie Dean. Wilhelmina Dean, or Minnie as she was often referred to, was a nanny in New Zealand during 1880 and was a well-known caretaker in her town. But something was off with the woman, and soon she began having quite the dark spot on her name and career. In 1889, one of the young people under her care suddenly died, as if out of nowhere, and initially it was viewed as a freak accident, but 2 years later the same thing happened again. Now, with 2 minors perished under her care, police decided to investigate further into the matter. After a bit of sleuthing, it was concluded that under Minnie's care, the 2 minors were as she was attempting to take out life insurance on them. Police immediately took the remaining young boy in her care, finding it in dirty clothes and drinking curdled milk. By 1895, the investigation into her crimes continued, and she was spotted trying to flee on a train with another victim in her arms. And when police searched her house, they found 3 more covered up victims. Eventually found guilty for all her crimes, she was the first and only woman ever hanged in New Zealand. Next up at number 5, radiation test subject. In 1999, a man named Hisashi Uchi was a power plant technician, and he became known for being exposed to the highest amount of radiation of any human in history. While working at the Tokamura nuclear power plant, after a lack of safety protocols, improper training, and just an overall pressure to meet deadlines, Uchi and his coworkers made a terrible error. They mistakenly mixed an incorrect measurement of radioactive materials into the wrong tank, and as you've probably figured out, it caused a near fatal burst of gamma rays. Hisashi, who happened to be the closest to the incident, was brutally injured and sent to the hospital. Once he was there, it was discovered he had no more white blood cells, so essentially meaning that he had no remaining immune system. And despite being in intense pain with a rapidly deteriorating condition, doctors kept him alive under the family's request. So for 83 days, Uchi remained alive, being used as a test subject for experimental radiation treatment by the doctors, which, I mean, in their defense was the request of the family, but still, he endured several cardiac arrests, lost all of his skin, and suffered brain damage as well as organ failure. One of the last things Uchi ever said was, quote, "I can't take it anymore, I'm not a guinea pig." And then finally, one more cardiac arrest released him from his torture. Coming in at number 4, Mumia. Most widely practiced between the 12th to the 17th century, although there were a few cases in the 18th century that pop up, Mumia was widely used as a means of medicine in many European countries. Now, if you can't tell by the name, Mumia is creepily just as it sounds. The use of human remains ingredients to fix a living person's ailments. It was believed by many of the top physicians at the time that ingesting certain remains prompted the medicinal power of the mummy and could cure things like coagulated blood, pain, coughs, inflammation, cramps, and even heal open wounds. Now, they didn't just sit around eating the carcass directly. Instead, they would either grind the bones into a powder and drink it from there, or drink an extracted liquid from the embalmed individual. In fact, it was so popular at one point that it's believed the reason there are so few mummies these days is because of the high demand of flesh at the time. Coming in at number 3, James Jameson. One of the heirs to the Jameson whiskey family fortune, Jameson considered himself to be an adventurer of sorts and often traveled to far-off lands, detailing the trips in his diary. In 1888, Jameson decided to head out to explore the Congo, and while there he wrote about and demanded some gruesome things from the locals. So before beginning this expedition, Jameson discovered that the area he was visiting was known to have a population that participated in the eating of other humans. Apparently, Jameson set out to witness it firsthand, which, I mean, why was that his dream? A little suspicious if you ask me, but I digress. According to Asad Farhan, who was his translator for the trip, Jameson bought a girl from a trader of slaves for a few handkerchiefs and gave her over to the tribe to be. Allegedly, he didn't pay the tribe directly, but in a roundabout way, he did sort of pay to have this girl. What's even more gross is that he proceeded to draw and paint watercolors of the gruesome event while it happened, which again, just wrong on so many levels. Coming in at number 2, Cambodian Barbies. You may have been taught about the Khmer Rouge in history class, but if they don't ring a bell, essentially they were an extreme communist regime in Cambodia that held government between 1975 to 1979. They were known for being extremely cruel and committed some of the most horrifying acts of genocide in history, with nearly 2 million perishing under their ruling. Now, during their radical rule, the entire country was isolated from all foreign influences. This included closing schools, hospitals, factories, banks, foreign agriculture. They believed this would stimulate the rebirth of the country, but of course, all it did was send it into desolate famine and poverty. Led by a man named Pol Pot, the people of the country could not forage for food, despite the fact that everyone was starving, and anyone who disobeyed the orders was killed. Apparently, as the people became more and more desperate, they began to turn to folk magic, turning Barbie dolls into smoking talismans for luck. Thankfully, since its dissolution in 1999, all the leaders have been jailed for their atrocities, and the people are freed from the genocidal regime. And last up in our number 1 spot, the Rabbit Woman. Her name was Mary Toft, and in 1726 she became known throughout Surrey, England as having been the woman who gave birth to rabbits. Now, I know what you're thinking, that isn't possible. And you would be right, but still the story of how she convinced people it was real was crazy. Apparently Toft was actually pregnant at one point, but miscarried, and it could have been this that sent her into her madness. Toft began declaring that she was giving birth to various animal parts, and so her local doctor became involved in the case. At first, everyone actually believed her, as in fact a rabbit did, well, come out of her. And with a doctor backing up her claims, the king and his royal surgeon got involved. Unlike her local doctor, the king's surgeon was skeptical, and after discovering corn inside the stomach of one of the rabbits and hay in their droppings, it proved the animal hadn't developed inside Mary. Eventually, Mary Toft admitted to the hoax and explained that she had manually inserted the animals inside her to make the delivery as realistic as possible. She was immediately imprisoned for fraud, and the medical community was ridiculed for having been fooled.